Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And Helen Fry returns to the channel to talk about her latest book, The White Lady. Links to purchasing it are, of course, in the description below. It delves into the vital work undertaken across Belgium and, in fact, beyond by agents gathering intelligence and information relayed back to the UK. Details that absolutely help the Allies to victory in both wars. So I'll bring Helen in now. Good evening, Helen. How are you today?
Good evening. Hello, Paul. Hello, everyone. It's great to be back.
So we were just talking, I want to stress to the viewers, I put it in the sidebar, this covers both wars, First World War, Second World, because in my kind of interpretation, they're very different. The air war, sea war, land war, very different. But I was amazed that in terms of intelligence gathering, and specifically in Belgium, it's not just the same techniques, and it's the very same organizations, but in some cases, the very same people. That must have been remarkable when you found out that at the beginning of this research project.
Yes, it is. And, the Second World War Intelligence Network, this particular one, the Clarence Service, succeeds only because of the First World War, because in their youth, their younger days, the same leadership run the network known as La Dame Blanche, the White Lady, and the successors succeeded because of the techniques from the lessons that they learnt, but also, of course, Belgium being occupied in both world wars, as was the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. So France isn't occupied in the same way, and you've got, of course, Vichy France in the Second World War. So although it's a different level, if we look at the intelligence behind the lines, essentially for Belgium, it's here we go again, and we've done it before, and we know what to do.
Yeah, we've got a little bit of feedback on your mic. You just move your mic just a tiny bit. Well, I think that'd be better. Good. Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable because I think Belgium in both wars gets a bit short shrift, certainly in terms of what we've done. With intelligence, with SOE and everything, the Second World War, it's very France-centric, and then perhaps a bit of with the work done more recently about Burma and perhaps Yugoslavia. But Belgium, its location makes it so key because everything kind of passes through Belgium in terms of trains, in terms of logistics. For both world wars, the front line was there. And I say, and only in reading your book did I really realize how fundamentally important it was. It's the hub. It's the hub of everything. Everything that goes through Europe sort of goes through Belgium. I'm not wrong, am I?
No, you've hit the nail on the head. Belgium is probably, arguably, the most strategic country in. And, I hadn't realised that when I started out 25, 30 years ago. You just merrily get on writing the histories we're doing, and then suddenly, sort of everyone leapfrogs over Belgium. But then there's probably no surprise because a lot of the files, particularly for the Second World War, are only just starting to be declassified. So, we can be excused in that sense. But yes, when you start to delve now into what is available in archives in Brussels, it's just opened up a whole Pandora's box in a good way of material which I think is going to keep historians going for another 30 to 40 years. We are 30 to 40 years behind where the research is with France.
Yeah.
And of course, Kate Vigers has looked at the Belgian SOE and other countries in her mission Europe. And it's great. It's great that we can begin to tell those stories. But part of it is availability of what we have at what points in our career.
I mean, we'll get to this later on, but I watched your interview in the Imperial War Museum with our mutual friend Jackson, and you kept saying about, we've barely scratched the surface. There are thousands more archives we haven't looked at yet. There's documents there we haven't seen there. And you just said it about France there. France, there's some great work still being done about France, and we're getting to different levels, but it's sort of stories that to a certain extent we're familiar with just better research done at them. With this, The White Lady, it seemed that every page was, for me, new information. So we had someone talking about the fact that the White Lady is a cocktail. So I think we ought to explain just what the hell this means, and because there are these two networks that are set up between Britain and Belgium in the two wars that have this bizarre but very, very real connection.
Yes, so you have La Dame Blanche, we're called the White Lady. We had a debate as to whether to put La Dame Blanche on the cover or actually, but anyway, it's come up with the English translation. And yes, there may well be a cocktail, but it's not named after the network. And there is a pudding named in Belgium after the network, but it essentially is based on an ancient myth that I hadn't heard of. That if the German army sees the sort of ghostly figure of a white lady, it means it's about to fall. So that was something which psychologically the German soldiers, they kind of grew up with that in their mind. So I love the parallel and imagery that the German army will fall, as will the royal ruling dynasty in Germany, the Hohenzollern dynasty. So I love the fact that this network, this essentially what today we call MI6, is a British Secret Service network, has named itself after this legend, believing that its work, the intelligence they gather, will bring down the German army ultimately. And that's actually what happens. And then in the Second World War, because La Dame Blanche, the White Lady, is known, because one of the intelligence officers controversially wrote his memoirs, not in the UK, but outside the UK, not dissimilar to the Peter Wright scandal. And so he published his memoirs, named some of the agents, so they had to rename the network in World War II, which was named the Clarence Service, and they're doing it all over again. Now, Clarence Service was named after one of the co-leaders, so it's not named after any legend, but it also had very important symbolism. They use a stamp on their documents, like a seal, and it's George and the Dragon, which I love. So guess which one's George and guess which one's the dragon. So again, the symbolism is incredibly important behind these intelligence networks.
Now, the other thing, thank you for that. The other thing I find really intriguing is what people know about what is going to be useful to win a war, because there you are living in Belgium. We've just established how important it is in both wars, its location there. But you know, you as a Belgian civilian, and it's amazing how many were nuns in it seems in both wars. You know, what do you know is going to be the war-winning information that, if you can get back to London, will help win the war? Obviously, just any little detail can help, isn't it? But you can't just note down everything, because everything would become too much. So it intrigued me that a lot of this was just set up by people on their own. It's not like they were given instructions. They weren't given training. That most of them hadn't been given like a DIY how to be a spy book. They just did it off their own backs. Give us some of the examples of the kind of people that you wrote about and that had just natural aptitude for this in both wars.
Yeah, I suppose it's really knowing that if you can watch, it's very, very simple context. If you can watch those train networks, everything is moving by train, not very much by road, and the same in the Second World War. So very simple, you just watch everything that's going, and it's not for them to interpret how the information is going to be used. But certainly in the Second World War, we know that they get feedback as to what they need in particular areas, especially if there's been a bombing raid, to look on the ground, and they'll send a message back and say, well, actually, you hit half that depot, but there's still an interesting installation over there. Right, so there's that going on as well. But obviously, I suppose if we were civilians, we would use logic as to what we thought as well. That's interesting. So quite clearly, movement of troops and where they're going to be, because they're going to attack Allied forces. But also, it's going to be interesting ammunition dumps, defences. But they also noted, and in the Second World War, they were asked to note any movement of unusual objects, even if they couldn't identify them. And there was one particular train, and I write about it, it's the Clarence Service picks it up, that's a very odd shape. It's got like tarpaulin over it. It's quite long and it's heavily guarded. Now, they do say to MI6, we don't know what it is, but it's obviously important because it's heavily guarded. And even some of the V weapon stuff that was transported wasn't as heavily guarded as this. So the files don't tell us what it was, but they use their instinct as well. They're just really good at it. It's literally very simply, what do you see? What is the enemy doing? And the British intelligence, French intelligence services will find that helpful. It's then up to them to interpret. And they smuggle out plans, all kinds of things. They're using pigeons, well, pigeons in World War One. They've got radio operators in World War Two that are parachuted in. It's a really rich intelligence network in that sense. There's so much going on, but they are just two networks in what is quite extraordinary in Belgium in two world wars, and that is just vast.
I mean, I think you said like 200 networks or something, which, and Belgium's not a massive place, seems incredible. And the other thing is, and I want to sort of drill down on this, is that this is MI6 and it's these Belgian units. Well, you know, it's not SOE, but when we look at SOE,
Yes.
and you've written about the SOE, it has a fitful start, I think it would be fair to say. And it doesn't come out of the gates working very, very well. There are all sorts of issues with it, and then it becomes a very good tool. What I found intriguing is that, as we said, because this is picking up at the Second World War from what they had learnt in the First World War, they've got this foundation in place. They've got a core sense of, because trains moving through, the war has changed, but the rail network hadn't changed much. And I think that I was really surprised how swiftly. I mean, this is before, I want to stress, it's before the Belgian nation was even occupied by the Germans in the Second World War.
Yes.
That these people they've been rounded up by the people from the First World War who involved in it and say, okay, it looks like it's starting again. Go and get your notebook out, which I found incredible that they would just kind of pick up as if there had been like a sequel being made to a film 10 years later with the same cast.
Yeah, and the extraordinary thing is that a lot of these men and women, the women had extraordinary roles in the network on an equal basis with the men. The men and women, they were in their 60s and early 70s, right? You know, all over again. And they obviously recruit a new generation as well as the war progresses. But that was one of the things. I was just expecting this to kickstart around May 1940 when Belgium's occupied again. But they had a very important period between the 3rd of September 1939, when the key leader, Walter Dewey, one of Belgium's greatest heroes, he gets a knock on the door from a mysterious MI6 man, just only known as Daniel, and says, right, you know, call up the old guard of the White Lady. And he does, with this fearsome woman who was 74 years old, Thérèse de Radiguet, one of my heroines in that war. And together they get, you know, the whole leadership who are in their 60s and 70s. They start this board, and they're still quite small to start with in those sort of 8 or 9 months until the occupation. But they know that it's highly likely that Germany will occupy Belgium again. And so that's why they are watching for any signs of occupation. And for me, one of the things that really stood out, it's an early warning system.
Yeah.
And that's what they sort of call it. What stood out for me was that moment, you feel reading the text is quite kind of tense. They're sending messages back saying, the Germans are now cutting down all the hedgerows on the border. Day or so later, they're cutting the trees. And you think, yeah, it's imminent, isn't it? The invasion is imminent. And then, of course, it just expands and they do it all again. But they've got the experience, and that was so, so important. And they realise, because of what they delivered in the First World War, its significance. And I think it might be a good point to say here that the official history, the authorised history of MI6 says that and that's where they wrote to the leadership at the end of the First World War and said over 70% of all intelligence that the British Army in the field got, so the British Army headquarters got, and they were based in France, of course, over 70% from neutral, Holland and other neutral countries, came only from the White Lady network. And over 95% of the intelligence they got in World War One came only from this network. And you think, whoa. Yeah. And the risks that those agents took, and they didn't all survive, as you know from reading the book. It's like somebody said to me, oh my gosh, you know, I'm turning the pages, they're doing this and this. And then suddenly she's shot. And I said, yeah, there were some tense moments in the research. They don't all get shot, of course, but it was hugely risky, and they still kept going because they knew this was part of their fight for freedom.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
they're so heroic. Sorry, yes.
No, the fact you said that in the First World War, 95% of the intelligence coming from that one network, because when I talk to people like yourself, and Damien Lewis is on in a couple of days' time, and all these people, it's like, how do you measure the success of some of these covert type operations? One person sending a message back from one village in an occupied. How can you balance that against the massive size of the Allied assaults in both wars? But when you're saying 95%, I mean, it's a slam dunk, isn't it? Clearly, that's a huge contribution to the Allies' information to wage war. I mean, the Second World War changes a bit different because the technology changes on both sides, the war spreads out a bit. It's a very different type of war, but the fundamental fact that information is getting through works. And I think it's about, we should expand on, you mentioned pigeons in the First World War, but the Second World War, ingenuity has to come in again, because it's maybe a bit of a different setup there. So, and again, with your conversation with Jackson, I watched other ones, but that's the one I watched most recently, is that you don't know in the research all the methods used. You only know some of them, which is extraordinary, that it was so good and so secret that even in researching it 80 plus years later, you still don't know all the methods they use. But what were some of the ones you did find out?
So for the First World War, very simple spy craft techniques, hiding things in potatoes and lobbing them over the high voltage electrified fence from June 1915. Anything they could hide. They were very ingenious. They would sew messages into the linings of some of our soldiers that were being exfiltrated, that were being escaping on the escape lines. They hid stuff in bread, broom handles, in prams. If they're pushing a pram through occupied territory, anything they could think of. One of the nuns had some papers strapped to her leg. Anything they could do to get the material out. In the Second World War, that's the area we don't really know much about. And that's where it would have been great to have the eyewitness accounts. But sadly, there wasn't a single survivor of Clarence Service when I came to do this. Wow. So it wasn't possible to ask. But some of the children have occasional stories that their fathers have told them, particularly from the parachutists and couriers. And that's another thing, I think, which changes in this war that we don't appreciate, that there were these heroic Belgian parachutists that went to London. They had their training. They went pretty much, we think they all were sent from Thamesford Aerodrome back into Belgium. And not a single one of them was picked up by the Germans. And of course, they had to prepare landing zones, mainly in the Ardennes, actually. And one of the descendants took me to the place, and he said, and they know these traditions. It's gone through families, and he stood, and there are memorials to some aircrew that didn't survive other operations. And you stand there and say, this is where they land. You look over this vast plain that it is quite hidden, but in the Ardennes region, you think, oh wow, and you just think that the heroism of those parachutists, and we don't know much about them here in the UK. They are highly commended in Belgium in commemorations today, along with all of their agents and intelligence officers. But the parachutists are held in really high esteem.
And it's interesting because when I think of the Ardennes, I think of many things before I think of spy networks, before I think of agents jumping out of aircraft. It's got so many other things, the First World War, Maginot Line, Germans come around the corner. Then I think of 44 and Bastogne and Houffalize and all that. And I again, we're very Franco-centric with our understanding of networks and spying and things like that, which brings me to a question from one of the viewers, Sean Brennan there, which I'll put to you about researching Belgium. Belgium has French
Yes.
and Flemish speakers. Was this reflected in the White Lady and Clarence spy networks, and in also your research? Did they overlap? Was it separate? How did that work?
So it goes back to the fact that we need more research. I did come across Flemish and Dutch documents, not very many agents that had written up their accounts in Flemish, primarily, and it's historically, the difficulties between the French speaking and the Flemish speaking communities. I don't want to go into details because it's still very, very sensitive. I think today I understand, and so I wouldn't want to step on any sensitivities, because there have been huge efforts since the 1960s to heal this, but primarily these two networks were French speaking.
Okay, thank you. And then to move on from that, and we've talked about a little bit about how these messages got out. The other thing about the any intelligence network is there's going to be an enemy response to it. And one of the tragic stories of all the networks, whether you're talking Burma, Yugoslavia, France, Belgium, is in the Second World War, the Abwehr, the Gestapo, traitors, people breaking networks. When you're comparing the two wars, because there was counterintelligence in the First World War and in the Second World War, was the enemy doing it in the same way in both wars? Was one war noticeably, was the Gestapo in the Second World War noticeably more effective than the intelligence services the Germans had in the First World War? What are your summations of that, comparing the two wars?
Well, from what I've researched for the White Lady, they were really vulnerable, and it wasn't just the White Lady. It was its predecessor, which was the Lambrecht service. Walter Dewey's cousin, Dieudonné Lambrecht, led it as Lambrecht service that became the White Lady. And of course, around 1915-16, the Belgian networks are decimated by those German counterintelligence. Some of it was luck, just watching places. Sometimes people were picked up because they'd smashed a network in this house, and in one case, the neighbour next door, this was actually in Brussels, he was taken, and he was involved in the network, but they never found any evidence and let him go. So sometimes they sort of second guess. Sometimes it was a lapse in security that they probably couldn't have helped. And so they were very, very successful, the Germans, in the First World War, and they were as brutal as well, actually, in how they treated the agents. But they weren't stupid. They knew that ordinary people would help, and they couldn't really get any collaborators from amongst the French speakers. So I pretty much didn't find any sort of those that would collaborate to bring down the network. It's just that these very small, fragile networks were infiltrated. In the Second World War, well, I can't speak for the other 239 networks. Well, there are over, I've been told, 240 resistance, intelligence, everything. So not just intelligence, but resistance as well in Belgium. And Clarence had, and I have this on good authority from Belgium, from experts in Belgium, from the State Security archivist, that just 2% of Clarence agents were compromised. So hugely different. It does pretty much survive intact. Walter Dewey's in hiding until January 1944, and unfortunately he does lose his life, but that's because he's running away. They don't realise he's in the house, and when he's running away for all sorts of complicated reasons, they shoot him, but they don't realise he's actually the leader of the network. So that kind of thing happens, but they seem to have had a tighter security than in the First World War. But the networks were still relatively small, actually. They were still quite small. And it looks like, although we don't know for sure, not everybody in the network knew each other. So again, it's trying to keep some semblance of safety there.
Okay, thank you. I want to bring in motivations for some of these Belgians, both in the First World War and the Second World War, because we talked with Nala Ayed yesterday about the two SOE agents she wrote about, and Sonia, 20 years old, British, French, wanting to strike back. But Belgium's role in the First World War was different to the Second World War. All the interwar period, there's border changes, there's negotiations, Alsace with France and Germany's going on. There's the people that were recruited in the Second World War. Let's start with them, because you said the existing people that have been in the networks in the First World War then kind of built new people into it. Was there a particular type of person they were looking for? Was it obviously patriotic, but was there a particular type?
No, or social background. So you have a lot of aristocratic or upper class families helping, as well as those who are really, on the breadline, the sort of living in little peasant cottages. So there is no obvious. It's a patriotism, and I know it might sound very simple to say this, but it's a fight for freedom. They've been there before in the First World War. And one of the agents of the escape line, Peggy Van Leer, it's a different book, but Peggy Van Leer said it's only when you've lost freedom you realise it's the most important thing. And I interviewed her friend during her lifetime, Elsie Marachal, and she said, and I probably talked to you about this on one of the previous shows, she said the fight for freedom transcended everything. They knew what it was like to be occupied. And I guess for those of us that are in the UK, we haven't lived under an occupation, have we? I don't know how many hundreds of years. I can think back how many hundreds of years since we have anything equivalent. So until you're in that situation, I think it can be very, very difficult to understand. But it's a sort of natural patriotism. Although, look, we were at threat in the Second World War, weren't we, of invasion by Nazi Germany? And people did say, well, good luck if they'd taken us, because of all the resistance, the units that would have sprung up and done all sorts of tricks. So, yeah, I think there is a core of that sort of resistance of patriotism, but it is wanting your freedom. And you can't hold down that spirit and that fight for freedom. The hardest part of any of these stories, and whether it's France, Belgium, or anywhere else, are those collaborators and those that will betray, because I can't get my head around that. It's the most horrific thing to do, because people actually lose their lives as a result. And one of the things I did I hope this is okay to say, but when I went to Belgium just a few weeks ago to promote the book, I had a couple of talks that they invited me to talk. I also had a couple of days when I could do a little bit of research. One day I was a tourist, but I'd never been to the shooting grounds, 2 of them. And I don't know why I'd never been there, but my friend took me. He knows this area very, very well. And to stand in that place where they were shot for helping us, I mean, I can't even begin to describe the heroism. And then to walk along the lines and see the names. And I said to my friend Peter, oh my gosh, there's Emile. He's in my book. And it's that, it's no longer in your head.
Yeah.
And then you see the actual spot. They've marked the spot where they were shot. And it's got one ground felt worse than the other, actually. It had a sense of being, you could just feel it. It was the First World War one, actually. You could just feel, it wasn't evil, but just the desolation, and that something horrific had happened there. And it's quite something to do. I know, I'm sure your audience do go to places that they're interested in, because you do get a sense of place. And I wasn't expecting to feel how I felt standing in those places and then seeing the names of the agents and thinking, oh my gosh, there's a whole cluster of them, of a whole sector, and they're all buried together.
Wow, yeah.
It's just that moment.
Gina, regular viewers, asking you which particular area that was, the one that was the most affecting for you.
In Ghent.
Okay.
In Ghent. So I went to Ghent and I went to the Tir National in Brussels. The Tir National, actually, now, it was a huge, vast shooting range where they used to practice. It was sort of on the outskirts of Brussels. Of course, it's not anymore. They're building all around it, so it's much smaller. There are still quite a few trees around, but they've shrunk it really considerably. But there's also a memorial there to those Belgians that ended up in concentration camps. So really important to sort of see, how they've commemorated those two very different places. And apparently there are other shooting grounds across Belgium that I wasn't aware of, including, I think, one of the harbours. The Germans had shooting grounds to shoot spies almost everywhere, really, in most towns. So there's some commemoration in most places, but it is worth seeing.
Yeah, thank you. And that's led me to another question, because I was reading a book in bed last night. It's a completely random story, but it will set the scene, about two Canadian officers who fought in the Highland Light Infantry in Normandy, and how they created a bond. And quarter of the way into the book, it's a graphic novel. I felt I knew these two people intimately. I knew about their wives. I knew about their background. When you write a lot about this shadowy world of intelligence and undercover and stuff, where there's code names and there's fake stories and fake identities, and there's people not always revealing everything about themselves. And indeed, you have, as a historian, having dead ends where you know that they met a person, but this person doesn't exist in the files. Does that mean sometimes it can be difficult to kind of get a rapport with the people you're writing about, because they are a bit shadowy?
Funnily enough, I haven't found that, and maybe it's because I was taken around Belgium quite early on, to
Right.
all the key sites that we wouldn't normally know. This chateau here, this is where this happened. You get a sense of the distance, and just nothing's really changed. If you look around parts of the countryside of Ciney, Namur, it could be just as it was 80, 120 years ago. And that was incredibly helpful, actually. But you do, when you start to piece together and to speak to some of the families, you get the person comes alive, like Therese de Radiguez. The family spoke about her. And there was one particular family I visited, and they got some stuff out ready to show me. And they probably had never thought about it, but a vast number of the members of the family, including aunts, uncles, whatever, had been involved in 2 world wars, and there were just these whole row of just medals. And it was like, and really high level. And you're thinking, men and women, you're thinking, oh my gosh, and this is just one family. And yeah, just little things like that start to sort of build between the lines, because you're quite right, there are lots of gaps. There are gaps in the history, there are gaps in the intelligence reports, and of course I only touched the surface of some of these characters, and how much more is still to come out.
Well, I mean, that's what in reading the book and your interviews you've done already, is that this seems to be the beginning of a new strand of history that maybe yourself in the future, and indeed other historians, will jump into this and say, yeah, this is you should see what's still to be uncovered, because the National Archives in the UK have been such an incredible resource for people like yourself and Damien Lewis and Claire Mullin and others, these people. And then you're realizing that other countries are, as you said, maybe Belgium's a bit, our understanding of Belgium in World War II is a bit behind where we are with France, but their
definitely
archives are being digitalized. There are incredible historians out there who know their subjects and know their local areas. And it seems that this, as I said earlier, it's a book that is asking as many questions as it is answering, because it's a gateway. It's like a gateway drug to begin to understand Belgium's role in both these wars.
Yeah, and it comes back again every time I sort of poke this area, or even when I visit there. I just, not overwhelmed, but just the sense of heroism. And I know I've said that quite a bit today. I don't think people really quite understand or have quite comprehended yet. And why would we? But I just stand in utter awe of a country that delivered so much. Well, I'll give you an idea of the First World War, for example, of the archives. So there is an index, and they're not, some of them are digitized, but not very many. The Second World War files are not digitized, so you have to sit in the state archives, but that's fine. It's great fun. But in the First World War, each of the intelligence and agents, so not necessarily named, but if they've got a sort of network, they've got an entry in how many folders there are that you can consult in the state archives. That list, and I can't remember if I said this on Jackson's programme, that list runs to 420 pages of A4. That's just for the First World War. So if anyone wants to get started, one person can't do it. You know, in the Second World War, they've got at least 240 resistance intelligence groups.
Yeah.
And so I think this is going to be so fascinating for anyone who wants to start. You have to find a way to manage the material, or maybe even focus on one or two connected networks.
Yeah.
It's just going to throw up so much, and it's so rich if you just stand there and no one's read any of this before. And it's wonderful. It's a historian's dream, really, to begin to piece together this history and then realise that for 80 years, World War II, more, of course, World War One, that nation existed in silence, really. We did not know just how much they contributed to our freedoms in Europe. And I think I do encourage people to please start researching more. And we are learning a lot more. We're learning things which I never found out in my 30-year career. And that is that we sent some of those Belgian agents were sent from Belgium deep into Germany, deep into Luxembourg. Now, I knew there were missions from London and the Admiralty, and they infiltrated people in and all that kind of thing. But they actually sent some of them from within Belgium. And again, you know, you wouldn't necessarily think that. You'd think, well, they're busy collecting all the intelligence and getting it out. That's one thing. But to actually send those agents to do the same thing right across Germany is, and you know, what did they bring back? We've got a little bit of an idea of what they brought back. But again, this needs to be studied in more detail.
We had a question from Dennis about how large these networks were, the two that you're talking about, because I was surprised. I mean, I know the answer, but I was surprised it was a larger figure than I would have guessed going into the book. I tend to think of very, very small, you know, but what's the answer?
Well, do you know, I had the other thing. I thought it was going to be a lot more.
Okay, well, so our brains work differently, clearly.
Yeah, I just thought this whole network. Well, I think I thought that because the network's covering the whole of, pretty much the whole of Belgium. By the end of the war, there's a map in my book of how that network is. So for First World War, 1,084 officially recognised agents, and there would be others that would have helped, but they're not sort of officially recognised, and 1,547 in Clarence Service. But they were, from what we can tell, they were probably the largest, actually, because I don't know for the Second World War, because those files are still being released, but for the First World War, some of those networks were incredibly small. And a lot of people make a lot, quite rightly, of the bravery of Gabrielle Petite. She lost her life in 1916. Her network was one of those, the Petite Service, it was one of those that went down. And she delivered over 15 reports of vital significance. And a lot was being made of this. And I was asked, you know, why didn't you put her in the book? Is she connected to this network? Well, she isn't, as far as we can tell. And then I pulled her files. How many agents in her network? Do you want to have a guess, Paul? I'm asking you the questions now.
45.
4,
okay,
including herself. I was astounded. I was like, what? Just 4 of them. And I think anyone who's written on Gabrielle Petite before has got no idea that there were just 4 of these, all women.
Wow.
That delivered that intelligence. And so, yeah, things like that I think are important, because again, we can start making a different assessment, different understanding. So I'm hoping going forwards, anyone who's writing about Gabrielle Petite will not, you know, think it's sort of, you know, hundreds that are working for us, just 4 of them.
Wow. In talking about the women have formed a central part of many of your books, not notably this one. And when I was reading about SOE, MI6 things back in my 20s, it was always that that women were the ones who could move through occupied Europe easier. So they were selected for that, as if that is their key thing. But as I move forward, and thanks to the work of yourself and Kate Weiger's others, I'm now thinking, no, it's actually that they're just better at it naturally. I think they may be less suspicious, but it seems to me there is an aptitude. There is something about, and there's maybe even saying it sounds misogynistic, but I'm saying it, but there's something about the wiring of the female brain that seems to lend itself to this sort of activity. Am I completely wrong, or do you see something in this?
Well, they wouldn't have seen it like that. I think there's still a fair bit of analysis to do. I think it really is, the women were not barred on gender, if you like.
Yeah.
They were saying if you can do the job, you do it, and that's why in these networks there is an egalitarianism. In actual fact, you haven't got women just limited to the clerical side, because don't forget, they had various centres where they collected the intelligence, but also they were writing sort of reports and analysing, and some of them did that, but it wasn't only them. And they're heads of sectors, they're running their own agents, so they're agent handlers. They are also militarised, and this was something I don't know whether you picked up on from Jackson's chat with me, but I've not come across this, and I don't know whether our audience have. In the First World War, Walter Dewey said he picked up the network in 1916, and British intelligence made contact, and he said, we will do this. We've got a whole pile of reports waiting to be sent to London. We will do this on one condition, that you militarise us. They're not in uniform. They've got no ammunition, no arms, nothing to fight with, but they wanted to be seen as part of the British Army. And Henry Landau, the intelligence officer, said yes, even though he had no permission from Mansfield Cumming, first head of MI6, Secret Intelligence Service, and he had no authority from the War Office. But he knew if he waited for that permission, these intelligence would be piling up, and they weren't going to do anything. I love that demand that they've made. And then in the Second World War, it all kicks off again. Yeah, we'll do it for you. Knock on the door from Daniel of SIS. Yeah, we'll do it all against Walter Dewey, but give us military ranks. And so Thérèse de Radigues ended up becoming Lieutenant Thérèse de Radigues, and she's there's nothing. If they're head of a sector, they've got a particular rank, so there's that equality. And of course, you haven't got an equivalent for women either, not really, have you, in the British Army at this time? I stand to be corrected, but they're civilians.
No, that's a very good point.
And developed stuff since, but
and it was something you said there. It got me thinking about things. Is that it seemed that this network, particularly the Second World War, but also the First World War, was very self-governing. I tend to think of SOE as being always, and indeed the resistance generally in places like France, just waiting for instructions. London basically decided everything. They told you what to do, where to go, it seems that this network they're just, the fact that they're organizing themselves like their own army. They are also saying, yeah, no, we will decide what intelligence, we will create our own missions, and we will send the information to London. Is that's very, is that a Belgian thing? Is that kind of that small nation trying to kind of a mentality of the fact they're surrounded by bigger nations, that sort of stubbornness of the Belgians being proactive?
I wouldn't say they were stubborn, but a degree of autonomy. And I think, well, we don't know from the MI6 side, because we don't have very much. You have the occasional correspondence there, but it looks like they've been they've been trusted, to do, because of what they delivered in the First World War. But you're right, it's the same with the escape line in Belgium, the Comet line. There was a degree when it sort of wanted to come under MI9. Well, MI9 said, right, well, we want to take over it. And Andre de Jong and the other leaders said, no, you are not on the ground. By the time something, we got an emergency, by the time we get back, that gets to London and we get a response, we're all been shot, kind of thing. So they said, no, we are going to keep command of our network. And that's what they did with the escape lines in World War II. And MI9 accepted that. It didn't happen like that elsewhere with MI9's networks. So it is interesting, but it's pragmatic as well. I see a good degree of trust on both sides, but then you also get correspondence from Major Page, is his code name. The head of the Belgian desk at MI6 is Jemson, Frederick Jemson, and he writes and says, we're just sending over some cylinders, some supplies, drops on this night. It's very much a free-flowing two-way thing. And they will also say what kind of, we've had rumours. No, don't use the word rumours, but we believe there's something happening along the coastline at here.
Yeah.
Agents to cover. So they would also give them some directives, but they weren't orders. And you do get the feeling that although it's officially under MI6 umbrella, these are both official MI6 networks, whereas not all of them were. But nevertheless, they are not just running the show from London. The people on the ground, they have to be able to react to what's happening.
Which goes back this sense that you said there, that the information they are getting to London must be of sufficiently high quality that London are going, there's no point us trying to tweak this. This is actually working very well. As you say, let it run on its own. Our attention should be better somewhere else where things aren't working so well. Let's just, this is a great asset. Let's keep it doing. So, because we're World War II TV, I mean, the one of the things that in the blurbers about your book and the description about the book, you talk about the V weapons.
Yes.
Because, as we said earlier, that establishing exactly what is found from intelligence is very difficult because it's just lots and lots of data about train movements. But the V weapon stuff is kind of it's a slam dunk, is it? This is something they absolutely provided information that was vital. So would you like to elaborate, please?
Yeah, so that was something I analysed during the course of my research. So there are archives in the Imperial War Museum and state archives in Brussels, and they're different. The intelligence reports survive for the Clarence Service in the Imperial War Museum. They're all in French, they're typed. They're not for the whole of the war, so there are some missing either end, which is interesting in itself. But they are, it's just a sheer volume of information. And as a historian, you say, what are you going to do to digest this? And it might say around Ghent, this, ammunition dump, seen this, or whatever, unusual communication centre. So it's all that kind of things. It's maps and annotated photographs of, headquarters, whatever. So that's significant. So it's not just military installations, for want of a better word, but and the ports and stuff. It's also, Gestapo headquarters here, German army headquarters here. There's a camp here. So they're building a whole picture. But when I was analysing this, I thought, is it possible to do a trail of a big piece of intelligence? And of course the V weapons is exactly it. And they were given specific directives, those agents, to be on the lookout, because it could be anywhere in Belgium. That stuff could be moved, and it was moved mostly to Pas-de-Calais, but not only Pas-de-Calais, but Pas-de-Calais, Boulogne. There was some stuff up near Flanders. There was some V1 encasements that have been found not so long ago that are in the Secret War Museum there. So, they had to watch those train lines, but the highest value intelligence, and that's what the MI6 says, really at this time, are the secret weapons, and they are catching everything. Literally all those V1, V2 movements, particularly in July, August 1944, they're catching all of it. And they're even uncovering the factories where some of the parts were made. So they'll say, well, this factory used to make ball bearings, for want of a better, but they're now making parts for the V1, and they smuggled someone in. And one of the most extraordinary, I think, stories is the Luxembourg family, one of the Luxembourgers who's working for Clarence Service. He's Henry Roth. His son was amongst a group of young, under 20 Luxembourgers who have been living in Belgium, who were taken as forced labourers into Peenemünde. Our audience will know that's where it was all being developed. So they are forced labourers. The son, Leon Roth, and it's in my book, smuggles out V-weapon plans and testing results in December 1942. So, whoa. And you wouldn't know that apart from the Clarence Service files. And he gets that out. We don't know how he does it because that bit's missing at the moment. He gets it to one of the couriers, we know his name, and that gets to his father, who's part of the Clarence Service. So that, whoa, this young, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he's about 19, has used that opportunity as a forced labourer, knowing the value of what they're seeing and smuggling that stuff out.
I mean, that is incredible, isn't it? And that essentially is the flaw in the German plan, is everything they do secret. They are allowing people access to it via workers and delivery drivers and what have you. And if just one of them is got the right connections, or then everything the Germans are doing can be, sent by radio or courier straight back to London, and London know. You talked about the very kind of military setup of these networks. We had a great question from Jim earlier. If you're running a professional organization, there's the danger, of course, of betrayal. Someone joining
Yes.
from who's a traitor. But there's also the possibility of someone who wants to be part of this, but just isn't very good at their job, or they recognize wouldn't have the skills. So Jim said, what percentage of volunteers might have been turned down for whatever good reason? You don't obviously put adverts up in a cafe in Antwerp saying volunteers wanted for secret network, but you're kind of on the lookout for people you would know from your school days. But there must be people who would have wanted to be part of this, but would have had to have been turned down. Did you find any such cases?
No, I don't think that's how they recruited. In fact, the recruitment's one of the sort of missing pieces again. And what we do know is there are connections between some of the people that comes out in some of the files and some of the work they do, but quite often families. So it will run in families, and it's got to be really trusted networks. So these sectors seem to be fairly self-contained, fairly small, and they won't know who is ultimately at the head of the network. The only ones that would know are the very small board of, in this case, Clarence Service. So it wasn't like, you take someone on and they're not good enough. I didn't come across anything like that. It was people doing what they could in the situation where they are. And sometimes it's just small acts of currying something a small distance, but they're a vital cog.
Yeah, so you get given something light duties, and then if you're good at that, you kind of move up and get given more responsibility. That makes sense.
Could be. And a lot of these, what I was struck by was the feistiness of a lot of those young women. And I like the Gabrielle Petites. You get them in the Second World War as well, prepared to do their bit. They understood very well. They don't want to get caught. And I don't see any grading. Well, their duties according to their rank, but I don't see them going through a selection process. I see no evidence that they went through a selection process like they would with the SOE. And don't forget, they're doing something very, very different. There are eyes and ears on the ground. They are just passing back, what they see. And compiling that, and it goes to a letterbox. Sometimes it's a dead letterbox. They don't know who picks up the stuff. Sometimes they might just drop it into a post office or post box, or even into the grocers. They don't see the next person in the chain. They just know their role is to do X, Y, and they might not know that somebody down the road is also doing this, although they do have in regions quite a close network. And you do think actually they could be vulnerable to being penetrated, of course, but there needs to be more study, and I don't know we've got enough evidence yet from what's been declassified. It's still going to take them another 5 years, by the way, to declassify everything they want to do. Why the security of this succeeded where it didn't. What were the lessons from World War One or even from other World War Two networks. It's still too early to make those assessments. At the moment, it's important to get the basic stories down there, which is what this book does.
Yeah.
And then the assessment starts to come. It's a sort of next level, isn't it? You can do a bit of that with this book, but we just don't even know the basics. And that's not a criticism. That's literally, there's an exciting archive out there waiting for people to discover and start to begin to analyse.
Yeah, and I think, as I said at the beginning, it's quite a brave move of you to kind of release it. It's a finished, but at the same time unfinished project. Your book has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It ties up the themes you bring up quite well, but it leaves the potential for a sequel. I think is the or several sequels. That there is some uncertainty about why it prospered so well. We had a question from Willie Robertson. You talked about the success of this network. Did MI6 try to establish or transfer this Belgian model onto other networks? Because as we've talked about, there are intelligence is working with different levels of efficiency, shall we say, in different occupied countries, but this clearly is working very well. Did MI6 go, hang on, we've got something here, why is this working well, and can we take what's working well and transfer it elsewhere?
Well, they started up pretty much simultaneously in Luxembourg, so one can't say one sort of influenced the other. I don't know enough about, because I just haven't studied Holland, for example, or the Netherlands in the Second World War. I mean, I know about the Engelspiel, I've done a bit about that. I've done about the agents that were parachuted in with Intelligence School 9, IS9, and then there's, of course, the SOE and all that, and King Kong Lindeman's betrayal. But I don't really know, and I'm not quite sure that the material survives at our end about the intelligence networks in Holland, come to think of it. So whether they've got anything, they must have, in Dutch archives, whether they've even been released. But I would be very surprised if there wasn't something. And of course, because it's an organisation that's so secretive still, and I understand totally why, we don't have a complete picture for other occupied countries. France, of course, you have the Alliance or Noah's Ark network. Marie Fourcade has been written about, and she names her agents after animals. It's great that they're named after animals, but they seem to be different. And again, we don't have the intelligence archives of what they smuggled out. And as far as I'm aware, they're not available in France, and they're not, obviously MI6 never releases its files. We're just lucky that what we've had for Belgium now, we can analyse, and we've got some of the intelligence reports. I would suspect that's pretty rare in actual fact. Okay.
So I think my last question, but as you said, you've been studying this aspect of World War II and World War One for 20, 30 years. In a sense, nothing surprises you now. You've read about betrayals and walls have ears and double agents and triple agents and networks and gadgets and messages. So if someone is new to one of your books, there'll be plenty of wow moments. So oh my God, they did that. Oh my God, that was possible. But as I said, it's sort of, to some extent, it's water off a duck's back for you, because that's been the field you've lived in for so long. But during this book, what was I'm going to have to put this archive down for a moment and have a lie down in a darkened room, this thing is blowing my mind moment? Did you have one of those moments about this network where you just, even someone of your experience when this is insane, this is incredible, what I didn't know this?
Yeah, I think it goes back. I mean, there were several moments, and something I'm working on at the moment, one of the testimonies from Belgium. I'm not necessarily going to write about other intelligence networks in Belgium to watch this space, actually. But this person's been smuggling, getting our guys out. You're following all the trail. It's quite sort of busy, and you're doing all this, and then suddenly he's told, "Your life, you got to get out, and for good." And he writes in his report, and it made me very emotional at the time. I wasn't expecting it, and he wrote, "We crossed the border for the last time." and it was just something about his words, and it does it. I think I never cease to be amazed about the connections, the emotional connection. And for this book, one of those wow moments was Therese Radiguez. She's 79 years old. In January 1944, when Walter Dewey flees her house, he ends up getting shot. You can read about it, our audience, in the book. And she's about to face the Gestapo. Now, I could never have imagined, you're kind of holding your breath, and they've taken her in, suspect her of being a spy. Her name's possibly been compromised over some radio network. We're not 100% sure, and the network isn't sure. So she's got to get out. And they say, no, I'm staying put. So she's facing the Gestapo. What do you do at 79 years old? She feigns senile dementia. And I love it. I think, what a woman. There's a photograph of her in the book. She's World War One. I mean, that face, that determination on her face. And then I got a photograph of her in World War II, and she's like somebody's cuddly nanny. But she was heading the whole sector that delivered the V weapon intelligence. And in January 1944, the Gestapo, the officers were getting all kind of, they were getting quite a telling off actually from their command, saying, who's brought her in? You idiots. She's got senile dementia. She's not a spy. And they let her go, and she goes on to deliver her agents that V weapon intelligence 6 months later. And she carries on and runs it to the end of the war and beyond, because they're watching an army in retreat as well. I mean, stories like that, I've ceased thinking I'm not going to find anything that's magical, because it is. And again, it's the human spirit, human ingenuity. You think, no way, she did what? And so I'm still inspired. I think I'm always going to be inspired by these stories, even though I've told lots in the past. Nothing. It still has the power to affect.
Well, I mean, that's what comes across every time I see you interviewed. It's almost your knowledge is incredible, but you have this kind of first day at work excitement for it, which is a testament to the fact that you are like someone coming back from school on their first day. Oh, it's amazing! They let me use the crayons. I did this. I got my own bag, and that's something that there are some historians who could maybe learn a little bit to kind of keep them going a bit, and not just churn out things. But that story there about a 79-year-old lady feigning is incredible, and I think that's the mic drop moment to end this at. And I'll remind folks and say this covers both wars, and the same characters come back. And again, it is about networks. It is about establishing up of couriers, but at its heart, it's about people. It's about people and finding a level of resourcefulness that, frankly, just amazes me. I can never, no matter how long I spend interviewing people about World War II, I never will understand what made these people jump into the cockpits of aircraft and take messages out of occupied countries. It's a depth of patriotism and duty and dedication that I'm still in awe of, and I'm glad you are still in awe of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to tell these stories when we can. So thank you.
Thank you. So there you are, folks. It's in the links to buy the book or at your favorite bookstore. And you're doing the rounds. You're in Imperial War Museum this weekend. You've got more tours to do, more book signings, more this, more that, and then it's back, I guess, to the word mines to dig us another story for the future, because you've got more stories to tell, and we can't wait. So the link to your website is in the description below, the links to the book there. And I will see you all tomorrow when I'm joined by Richard Vine, and we're looking at the sometimes difficult relationship between Charles de Gaulle and Sir Winston Churchill. I'm really looking forward to that one. As a foot in each camp of France and the UK, I'm really looking forward to talking to Richard about those two figures. As always, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books. But folks, I will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, viewers. Bye.